Hello, everybody, and welcome to Autism Unmasked, Candid Conversations. Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue à l'Autisme démasqué, conversation candide. Je pense nous allons attendre quelques minutes que tout le monde arrive. There's lots of people coming in, so we'll just wait a moment or two and give everyone a chance to enter. Okay, it seems to have slowed down. Yes, I will get us started. Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled to have you here with us today for this webinar. I'm going to jump right into it. With a little bit of housekeeping, this presentation is being recorded and will be captioned in both languages for on-demand viewing. As you may have gathered, we're going to be speaking in both French and English throughout, but you'll get a captioned version by email. Everyone is on mute with cameras off. To ask additional questions to those that you may have sent in, you can use the QA function, and you'll remain anonymous in the spirit of today's presentation. Cette présentation est enregistrée et sera sous-titrée dans les deux langues pour un visionnage à la demande. Tout le monde est en sourdine et les caméras sont éteintes. Pour poser une question, utilise la fonction Q et R. Vous resterez anonyme. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our fabulous panelists today. My name is Ali Dusso. I'll be your moderator. I'm the National Director of Employment for Auticon Canada. Avec nous est Jean-Julien Guillot, coordinateur de l'emploi. Avant de se joindre à Auticon, Jean-Julien a travaillé pendant 20 ans comme stratège en marketing, occupant des postes de direction dans de grandes entreprises canadiennes et internationales. Diagnostiqué autiste à l'âge d'adulte, l'expérience vécue de Jean-Julien alimente son approche de coaching et lui permet de comprendre les défis que les personnes autistes peuvent rencontrer en milieu de travail. Bienvenue, Jean-Julien. With us today also is Tony Minas, Project Manager for Neuroinclusion Services at Auticon Canada. Tony brings 10 years of experience from the public and private sectors, where she worked with both businesses and historically marginalized communities to develop and implement inclusive and trauma-informed workplace solutions. Tony's background in adult education, as well as her lived experience as a neurodivergent and racialized woman, drive her passion for neuroinclusion. Welcome, Tony. We are coming to you as Auticon Canada. We are a global social enterprise providing neurodivergent technology resources, education, advisory, and support. Fondée il y a plus que 10 ans, notre entreprise emploie plus que 500 personnes autistes dans le monde. We are an autistic majority company and are proudly the world's largest employer of autistic talent globally. Nous offrons un programme complet de formation en neuroinclusion. We are proud to be here with you today and very excited to be having this important conversation. I will get to the exciting part that you're all here for. There's a lot of fear and anxiety around how to engage with autism and neurodiversity and how to engage in the topic of neurodiversity at work. Les gens ont peur de se tromper. And we think this is often the biggest barrier to learning and advancing neuroinclusion. C'est souvent la plus grand obstacle à l'apprentissage et à la progression de la neuroinclusion. Whenever a member of our team starts a presentation or a webinar or a workshop, we always start by saying that if people have uncomfortable questions, then those are probably really important questions to ask. So in designing this workshop, what we aimed to do was to give people a judgment-free environment where they could ask all those difficult questions and we could facilitate learning and growth. We had many impressive, interesting, raw questions come in from our participants. And what we've done is we've grouped them according to themes for our panelists. So I will get us started. The first theme that emerged was around language. What words to say, what not to say, questions around the medical model of autism, the social model, etc. So, Tony, let's start by turning this over to you. Can you talk to us a little bit about how to talk about autism?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you all. So I guess we'll jump right in terms of talking about autism. I think we tend to make it more complicated than it is, in that I often refer to being autistic and having an autistic identity very similar to having other identities, such as being a woman and being racialized, that it's very much integrated into who I am as a person. It's not necessarily a label in that sense. And so when talking about autism, I can give you the perspective of one autistic person, myself, of how I like to, you'll hear me saying autistic, which I'm referring to identity first language. And I'm referencing my identity as an autistic person first. That tends to be the way many autistic people identify. It's in consensus with sort of the broader autistic community. But of course, person first language has a really, really important place in when we have conversations around autism, but also the disability world in general, where person first language, as in person with autism or person with disability, can have an important space. So really, when we talk about any of these sort of we call them labels or experiences or realities, it's important to follow it's important to follow the lead of the, in this case, autistic person. And that would sort of be my guidance, is if somebody is referring to themselves as autistic, you can refer to them as autistic. If they're referring to themselves as a person with autism or someone on the spectrum, or something else, we sort of encourage you to follow their lead. But at Auticon in general, and sort of our guidance is to use identity first language, being autistic. Guess I'll leave it at there. And JJ, if you'd like to add more.
Oui, merci. Je pense qu'effectivement, le point de départ, c'est d'avoir cette appellation autiste, mais le défi est que chaque personne autiste a une réalité intrinsèque et ne s'applique pas à une autre personne autiste. Donc, c'est tout le défi, mais en même temps la richesse que cette réalité apporte. Et je pense que l'idée derrière ça, c'est d'aller au-delà de l'étiquette, de ne pas s'arrêter juste à cette notion peut-être restreinte par la compréhension qu'on peut en avoir, mais au contraire de profiter de l'opportunité que cette affirmation d'être une personne autiste offre à la personne et aux autres, de savoir comment elle voit le monde, comment elle fonctionne, quels peuvent être ses défis, comment elle peut finalement mieux cohabiter, collaborer, plutôt que d'être juste enfermée dans une étiquette qui souvent est mal ou peu comprise. On a souvent l'habitude de dire que quand on rencontre une personne autiste, on rencontre une personne autiste. C'est un petit peu ce que nous partageait Tony. Je pense qu'il faut garder ça en tête, que chaque personne autiste a une réalité différente, et c'est ça qui fait la richesse vraiment de cette appellation. Les étiquettes ont, je dirais, l'avantage de simplifier les choses, mais la simplification peut devenir un piège aussi. Ce qu'on se rend compte, c'est quand on dépasse cette notion d'étiquette, et on s'ouvre vraiment à la richesse que les personnes autistes peuvent apporter dans un écosystème social. Ce qui me permet d'ailleurs d'ouvrir un petit peu cette question sur l'approche médicale versus l'approche sociale. Moi, personnellement, j'ai eu une approche médicale au début, en recevant mon diagnostic tardivement. Pour être honnête, le diagnostic médical m'a pas donné beaucoup de réponses. En fait, ça m'a plutôt amené beaucoup de questions. Et je me suis rendu compte que l'approche sociale est souvent plus intéressante en complément d'une approche médicale, parce que c'est dans la société qu'on essaye de fonctionner. pas juste au travers de l'étiquette, mais des relations, de la compréhension de nos propres défis. Et donc, d'avoir cette approche sociale me paraît une suite logique à un diagnostic médical qui est beaucoup plus porteuse de possibilités et beaucoup plus, je dirais, motivante aussi pour les personnes autistes parce qu'elles ne se retrouvent pas enfermées dans un diagnostic, d'autant plus qu'on l'a spécifié avant. Un diagnostic pour une personne n'a pas la même représentation pour une autre personne. Par contre, ces deux mêmes personnes peuvent socialement interagir ensemble, peuvent collectivement interagir avec d'autres personnes. Donc l'approche sociale est vraiment celle que moi je privilégie, puis qui résonne aussi avec Autism Canada, puisque notre volonté est vraiment d'inscrire les personnes autistes dans une vision sociale inclusive et pas juste dans une vision médicale qui pourrait enfermer un petit peu les gens. Donc c'est de garder ça aussi en tête, que le modèle social, c'est plus de possibilités, plus d'opportunités pour permettre aux personnes autistes finalement de trouver ces points d'équilibre pour gagner en autonomie, comprendre le monde qui est différent des perceptions alistes que la majeure partie des gens peuvent avoir. Puis c'est pas une idée de s'opposer, personne cherche à avoir tort ou raison. En fait, l'idée c'est de travailler ensemble, puis de collaborer ensemble. Mais pour ça, il faut qu'on ait les oreilles ouvertes, les yeux ouverts, et pas se limiter à un diagnostic ou une vision seulement médicale, et pas se limiter non plus à des étiquettes.
Thank you so much, Jean-Julien. Tony, sorry, I thought I was muted for a second. Tony, Jean-Julien spoke quite a bit about the empowerment of the social model of autism. Do you think for our English speakers, you could explain a little bit about your perspective of the social model versus the medical model?
Absolutely. I'll try to do in English what JJ just very articulately did in French. Sort of our background and our traditional perspectives on autism or other experiences that now we talk about as being neurodivergent often come from the medical model, which is very deficit focused. So that's where we're looking at diagnostic criteria to understand how we can facilitate and support this person's transition into the social community, maybe help them build skills, but it's very much focused on the person. And the perception is that this person has deficits or has challenges that require different and unique assistance in that way. Whereas the social model really kind of pivots away from that and aligns more with the neurodiversity paradigm, which really just truly is celebrating that every single person in the world, including all 34 of us in this space, have a different mind. We have a different brain, each one of us. And we are able to really, once we're able to really acknowledge that and celebrate it, we're able to leverage the strengths that ultimately come out of all of our incredibly diverse minds. And so when we talk about neurodiversity, we're really talking about celebrating everyone and for their strengths and what they sort of can bring to the table, can bring to their jobs, their society, whatever that may be for them. But where that relates, coming back to the medical and social model, is that my view is that the social model and the neurodiversity paradigm are really rejecting the deficit-based medical model that focuses so much on fitting people into criteria, fitting people into sort of boxes. And I, for one, don't fit into many of those boxes as someone who was diagnosed as an adult. And it certainly shifted, I think, how I view my own identity as being autistic, as well as working with autistic folks, but also working with folks who are not autistic, and really understanding that all of us come from different perspectives and different ways of thinking and different ways of experiencing, and that's an incredible value that we all bring.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tony. And thanks for touching on the value of diversity of thought and experience and all that brings to our interactions. The next theme that emerged from the questions that we were sent related to loosely to the idea of disclosure. We had questions like, what do I do if someone tells me they're autistic? How do you know if someone's autistic? What should I say, when autism comes up? All of these types of questions. Jean-Julien, pouvez-vous partager votre point de vue?
Oui. Moi, ça m'appelle d'autres questions. Quand j'ai eu mon diagnostic, personne ne croyait que c'était vrai. Parce qu'on dit, ben, t'as pas l'air autiste, tu regardes les gens dans les yeux, tu parles, t'es fonctionnel. Et ça m'a vraiment permis de me rendre compte que c'était difficile pour bien des personnes autistes d'exprimer ce que pouvait être leur réalité autistique. Et donc, je pense que c'est aussi par la variété des expressions issues des personnes autistes qu'on arrive à comprendre qu'une personne autiste est singulière et unique, mais qu'il faut vraiment casser beaucoup de biais, beaucoup de préjugés qui sont véhiculés par la télévision, les séries, le cinéma. Malheureusement, on trouve beaucoup d'images qui sont juste une illustration de ce que peut être une personne autiste et pas une généralisation de ce qu'est une personne autiste. Donc, je pense que l'idée, c'est vraiment d'en parler, de poser des questions. Sans jugement, ce qui est très difficile en 2024 d'émettre une opinion sans porter un jugement, mais le bénéfice est que ça favorise une écoute et ça nous change un peu de mode parce que souvent on veut proposer des réponses, on veut tout de suite aller vers une solution, mais en fait on n'est pas malade quand on est autiste. On est juste né comme ça, puis c'est pas quelque chose qu'on transmet, qu'on donne à quelqu'un d'autre en éternuant. C'est juste une façon de percevoir le monde qui est peut-être un petit peu moins standard que la majeure partie du monde qui nous entoure. Donc en fait, c'est une opportunité, une richesse aussi de voir ça. Donc c'est un combat permanent, je dirais, d'avoir ces discussions-là, mais en même temps, c'est très rigolo. Moi, j'essaie toujours de mettre ça sous le signe de l'humour, en disant, décris-moi une personne autiste. Et souvent, les personnes sont même mal prises en disant, en fait, oui, quand j'y pense, je ne saurais pas comment décrire une personne autiste ou c'est très limité la vision que j'en ai. Donc, je vois ça plutôt comme une opportunité pour une personne autiste aussi d'exprimer sa réalité qui peut être différente d'une autre personne autiste aussi. Et donc, ces messages complémentaires vont pouvoir aider à plus de personnes autistes d'exprimer leur réalité autistique au niveau de la société.
Thank you. Tony, Jean-Julien has just spoken quite a bit about the idea of this being an opportunity to really ask questions, gain information, try to understand the autistic experience. Can you touch on some of these other questions that have been raised?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess first of all, I'll say you don't know if someone's autistic unless they tell you. To really just directly answer, how do I know if someone's autistic? And I think with that, I just want to say that, there's two autistic people that we're listening to right now, myself and Jean-Julien, who are incredibly different. And everything we do is incredibly different, despite the fact that both of us are autistic. And so I think in interacting with folks, we really can't make assumptions. And I think that's sort of the most, is I think a really, really important takeaway for me here. But then I think when somebody does tell you they're autistic, how do you respond? How do you react? And that tends to be something, especially in sort of the employment setting, can make folks quite anxious and can make folks quite uncomfortable. But I will also go as far to say, like, I was diagnosed about 1.5 years ago And it's also been it's terribly complicated sometimes sharing your reality with even people in your personal life. So it's an incredibly sort of complicated experience that everyone sort of goes through, or I should say every person that's thinking about whether I should share or whether I shouldn't share, are really going through a sort of a risk assessment of their personal risk, and to see if that's where they can be open or where they can't be. And where that comes into an employment setting really comes down to relationships that you have in your workplace, maybe psychological safety we talk about a lot, and if you sort of feel safe enough to do so. So if you do feel safe enough to do so, and you happen to tell your manager or tell a colleague that, hey, I'm autistic, I can tell you a couple things that maybe are not the correct thing to say, or maybe aren't the best thing to say, and have certainly been said to me. The first one was, but you don't look autistic. And I'm still unpacking what that means, because I'm not sure what it means to look autistic. I'm sure I can take some guesses, but that's one of them. Another one is, oh, I'm so sorry. When truthfully, it was a celebration for me to be able to understand my experience and understand why my brain worked the way it did and why I experienced the world the way I did. But having someone sort of respond to you in a very well-intentioned, like, I'm so sorry, is not necessarily a neutral approach or a supportive approach. Another one, you're so brave. Sort of things around that we typically wouldn't say to somebody else sharing parts of their identity. Like if I say hi, I'm South Asian, I don't think the response would be, you're so brave, or I'm so sorry. I think we know socially that that's inappropriate. And so, we're really at Auticon, we talk a lot about kind of extending these identities to that. And, how would you respond if somebody shared something else like that with you, another part of their identity? And I think what, Jean-Julien was speaking about, of really asking questions to understand, is incredibly important. I realize I'm bouncing around a little bit. It's the joys of a neurodivergent mind, but sort of the idea of, if somebody's telling you this, why may they be telling you this? And is there a reason they're telling you this? Is it because, oh, I just want you to know that I know this thing about me? Or is it because I want you to know that I have some communication differences and this will help us work better together? It's usually the latter, but often it's taken in other ways. And so when we're responding to someone sharing something quite personal and something that likely involved a risk assessment, sort of thinking about that perspective and thinking about, thinking about it as an opportunity. I think I'll go back to Jean-Julien's words of really getting to know someone better and understanding how you can improve your own relationship and engagement with that person. I went a little off track, Ali, but I hope I touched on that.
Super helpful, important information. I think as a follow-up question to either of you, given this question actually came up quite a few times, how do I know if someone's autistic? And the reality that both of you have expressed, which is you don't and you won't unless you're making assumptions, which you should probably avoid. What role does masking play in understanding and being aware of someone's identity? And yeah, I will leave it there.
C'est certain que surtout dans le cadre d'un autisme diagnostiqué tardivement, il y a une réalité qui frappe, c'est qu'on a réussi à naviguer dans un monde qui était peut-être pas nécessairement simple à découvrir pour une personne dont le développement neurologique n'a pas été standard. Alors, c'est très demandant, le camouflage. Ça requiert énormément d'énergie. il y a des vertus aussi à ça parce que ça permet de se protéger aussi, mais il y a un coût à la protection. Donc tout ce qui peut finalement amener une diminution de cette posture de camouflage va être au profit de chacun des individus dans une relation, parce que euh, le fait que on camoufle n'est pas une intention volontaire d'être malhonnête ou de cacher des choses, c'est juste une façon de survivre dans un environnement qui est pour nous moins évident à comprendre. Donc c'est quelque chose dont il faut avoir conscience. Je pense que l'idée, c'est de se fondre un petit peu dans la masse pour pas trop attirer l'attention, pour continuer à se développer, pour continuer à fonctionner. Moi, c'est ce que j'ai réussi à faire avec plus ou moins de succès pendant des années. Mais à un moment, le prix à payer, il faut passer à la caisse. Là, c'est très demandant d'un point de vue fatigue, par exemple. Donc, je pense que la persistance un petit peu des idées reçues et des fantasmes sur à quoi ressemble une personne autiste, ça peut aussi expliquer des fois qu'il y a il y a un sous-diagnostic aussi. En tout cas, moi, je pense que c'est ce que j'ai vécu aussi, et que, comme je le disais, on n'est pas malade en fait. C'est pas une maladie, c'est vraiment juste quelque chose qui requiert plus d'efforts pour nous. Puis je pense particulièrement pour les femmes en fait. Autant je pense pour les hommes, il y a moins de difficultés socialement parlant à être un petit peu plus isolé, bourru, euh, des fois pas parlable. Je pense que pour les femmes, c'est beaucoup plus demandant encore que pour les hommes, cette posture de camouflage. Mais quelle est une réalité partagée par les deux genres, hommes et femmes, c'est clair. Ouais.
Tony, is there anything that you'd like to add about masking and sort of the exhaustion associated and what it means, particularly in the workplace?
Absolutely. So I guess I'll share 2 points. I think one I'd like to share from my personal experience as a highly masking or historically highly masking autistic person, in that I was 30 years old when I was diagnosed. So I had spent 30 years being autistic, not knowing I was autistic, needing to cope and survive in a world that saw my mask and saw maybe at some point some of my challenges or places that I struggled or the differences that I had in communication or social interactions. They were likely more evident when I was much younger, but over time, and this is where a gendered lens is also really important, that girls and women tend to have sort of additional social demands as children. And because of that, sort of my own experience has been that I learned some pretty great skills around communication, but also learned some great masking skills, in that I was able to camouflage and hide my autistic traits for quite some time. And the other piece is that meant that I had to learn how to compensate for things that were a challenge for me instead of getting support. And that, even in the workplace, where I want to add how this related to me in the workplace, is I have worked in the autistic community and in the pan disabilities community for over 10 years. I worked with autistic people, but did not see myself among those autistic people. That was not what my experience was. And a lot of it, my perception, is that it had to do with the fact that the folks that I was working with didn't look like me and didn't share a gendered experience that I had. Then I started meeting some autistic women and started seeing that my masking looked a lot like other autistic women's masking. And it really, really helped me understand my experience. But those are sort of things that while I was sort of going through cycles of burnout, not realizing why I was going through cycles of burnout, once I was able to understand that I was engaging in masking on an ongoing basis, it started making sense why I was burning out all the time and why it just felt chronic, even though, you know, I was doing all of the self-care things we talk about, but I was still struggling. And it wasn't until I was able to identify places where I was masking and be able to feel safe enough to pull that back and start being myself, that, you know, I was able to battle that exhaustion and start breaking that cycle of breakout or burnout. And the one point I want to make is that coming to Auticon, before I knew about my own neurodivergence, one of our autistic colleagues said to me, I don't know where the mask ends and where I start. And that has always sat with me and been sort of something that I think a lot of autistic folks sort of navigate. And so while, you know, we really do a lot of encouraging of folks of, you know, creating environments where masking isn't required, it's also important to know that masking is a survival mechanism, and it's a coping mechanism, and it keeps a lot of neurodivergent and specifically autistic people safe. And so creating environments where folks don't have to do that, and folks like me aren't in sort of cycles of burnout due to needing to mask, you know, those environments are really, really important. And I think we'll get into that in later questions. But you know, while masking is an independent experience and an individual experience, there is a environmental factor, I think, that can truly play a strong part of combating the need to, I guess.
Thank you both for some really insightful commentary. This next theme is really about social communication, I think, understanding autistic communication, questions about some myths, I would say, around potentially the idea that autistic people are antisocial, or that there are particular ways of communicating that are considered rude. So I would love to hear from our panelists a little bit about this. Jean-Julien, est-ce que vous voulez commencer?
Oui, merci. Moi, cette question me fait beaucoup rire. Je vous invite à venir dans nos événements sociaux chez Auticon pour vous rendre compte que on n'est vraiment pas du tout des personnes antisociales, bien au contraire. C'est juste que la façon dont on interagit est plus directe et on tourne moins autour du pot. On a définitivement des capacités à échanger sur des sujets qui nous allument. Le smooshing, le small talk, les petites conversations, ça, on est peut-être moins fort là-dessus, ce qui peut donner l'impression qu'effectivement, on est un peu à l'écart. Mais pour rebondir sur le camouflage et le masking, ça fait un peu l'écho de ça. C'est que des fois, moi, je sais pas quoi dire, en fait. Des fois, je ne comprends pas les attentes qui sont exprimées dans ces échanges sociaux-là. Et c'est pas que j'aime pas les gens, c'est pas que ce qu'ils disent n'est pas intéressant, c'est juste que pour moi, dans mon câblage cérébral, il y a pas de il y a pas de choses qui allument, il y a pas de connexion d'une certaine façon qui peuvent m'activer moi. Donc c'est pas que je rejette ça, c'est juste qu'il n'y a pas de lien avec ce type de situation. Par contre, comme je le disais en préambule, j'ai des discussions passionnantes avec mes collègues sur des sujets complètement dingue, que ce soit de l'astrophysique, de la plongée sous-marine, des voyages, des séries télé. Donc c'est vraiment aussi souvent compliqué d'avoir une conversation continue. Parce que l'intérêt va se porter sur des éléments précis d'une conversation, mais pas sur un flux continu de conversation. Fait que des fois, effectivement, les gens me disent, mais est-ce que tu écoutes ce que je te dis? Oui, j'écoute. Mais c'est que juste ce que tu me dis, en fait, j'ai rien à dire là-dessus. Tu sais, donc, et là, les personnes peuvent se braquer en disant, ok, ce que je dis, ça t'intéresse pas. Je dis non, c'est pas ça. C'est juste que pour moi, j'ai rien de pertinent à dire là-dessus. Ok, c'est cool. Donc, je pense pas qu'on ait fondamentalement d'opposition à la socialisation. C'est juste que ça vient moins, en tout cas personnellement, ça vient moins me chercher. Puis c'est pas une volonté de me retirer, quoique des fois, pour être honnête, dans certains environnements très bruyants, quand il y a plusieurs conversations, je vais vous donner un exemple. Avec mon épouse, ça nous arrive d'aller au restaurant de temps en temps et on aime beaucoup ça, mais elle, pas tant en fait, parce que je suis en capacité d'écouter la conversation qui se passe à l'autre bout de la salle, mais pas nécessairement ce que ma femme est en train de me dire. Puis, donc ça me prend tout mon effort pour me concentrer. Puis j'adore ma femme. C'est pas que ce qu'elle dit n'est pas intéressant. C'est juste que mon attention est dirigée vers mille et une autres discussions qui alimentent ma conversation avec mon épouse. Alors c'est un peu fou, mais c'est pour vous donner une illustration des fois de comment on peut paraître antisocial, mais qu'on ne l'est pas du tout. C'est juste que notre focus, notre mode de fonctionnement au niveau sensoriel n'est peut-être pas adéquat pour une communication linéaire. Et donc, ça peut donner ce type de conclusion-là. Mais rassurez-vous, au contraire, on est avide de conversations. On aime beaucoup avoir ces conversations, mais des fois, on décroche. Puis on rembarque plus tard, mais c'est comme ça qu'on fonctionne.
Thank you, Jean-Julien. So many interesting insights. Tony, Jean-Julien spoke quite a bit about the idea that autistic people are not antisocial, but rather that might look a little bit different for many autistic folks, and that the sensory environment of a lot of social environments maybe pulls attention and may prohibit from engaging in what someone might think of as a typical social interaction. Do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'll make 2 points. One is I think I couldn't agree with Jean-Julien more that I would say it's different, not deficient. And I think that's often how autistic communication is perceived. And often that, you may see an autistic person in a nightmare of a sensory environment looking like they don't want to be there or that they're not having a great time. But I can also say that probably everyone on this webinar right now has attended an event and not wanted to be there for sensory things, for you're tired that day, you have work to do, or whatever it may be. So I think we all experience different levels of desire for social connection. I think that is one thing there, and I don't think there's something specific about autistic people that make autistic people inherently not have a desire to socialize. That has not been my experience, but also no two autistic people are the same. And so that's important. So I think one piece is that. The other thing I guess I want to share is there is a fascinating study that I really encourage everyone to look up, that was actually done in, I believe, the early 2000s, late 90s, around the double empathy problem, which was essentially, there was an autistic scientist who ran a study and had a group of autistic folks and had a group of non-autistic folks, and essentially had them both play the game Broken Telephone. So if I'm in the autistic group, I'm given a piece of information said in my ear, and I say it to the person next to me. It goes around the circle, and at the end, the point of the game is to ideally have the most accurate to what the first message was. Both groups independently, the autistic group and the non-autistic group, did fabulous. They were great at the game. However, when they mixed the groups, things fell apart. And that's when communication truly broke down. And what that study showed us, and there's been many studies since that have sort of built on this, is that autistic folks communicate differently, but we're seeing that autistic folks communicate with one another very well. Because essentially we're sort of speaking the same language. It's information transfer, it's direct. It's more based on precision and accuracy of the information rather than maybe relaying an emotion or using body language or using other things to convey meaning. So autistic communication maybe is more focused on that, whereas the other group who were all sort of had the same communication style or similar communication style were also really effective. And so what that told us is that when we work together, when we mix our groups and we have a neurodiverse group where we have lots of different ways of thinking and approaching things, that's where we tend to struggle to connect with one another. And I truly think, and this is sort of what's come out of this study too, is that while autistic folks, through the medical model and the reality we live in, are sort of coached and taught on an ongoing basis to build skills to be able to communicate with folks who are not autistic, that isn't necessarily reciprocated by the rest of the population. So the reason it's called the double empathy problem is myself as an autistic person, I'm working very, very hard to understand what the non-autistic person may be conveying to me. So I'm trying to pick up their social cues. I'm trying to understand meaning the way they do. However, that effort is not always reciprocated.
Sorry. Thank you, Tony. Very, very insightful. I'm wondering, just to add to that, because we did have someone put in this question, and I applaud them for their bravery, because it's a difficult question to ask, and I think it's an important question to address, around the relationship between tone and what you're talking about. Because I think oftentimes autistic people are perceived as rude. I would say, especially in the workplace, we hear this a lot, where perhaps that's also a difference between communication styles.
Yeah, I think we make a lot of assumptions. So when we have, in that same example, we have a neurotypical or non-autistic person and an autistic person communicating, we know that I'm trying not to use that word. We know that non-autistic folks tend to rely on body language and tone to convey meaning. So how I'm saying something, the tone I am using is a part of the message that I am conveying. However, many autistic folks tend to communicate focused on the information they need to convey. So you're receiving direct communication that it has all the words rather than needing to listen to my tone. So my tone isn't necessarily meaning anything. I'm not attaching any meaning to my tone. However, the non-autistic person that's receiving my communication is attaching assumptions to my tone based on how they communicate. And that's sort of where we come into the double empathy problem of, I understand, and I have been told as an autistic person that tone is an important piece of communication in the non-autistic world. I have had to learn that. I have had to sort of manage that and understand that has an impact. However, that same awareness and that same intention that autistic people are often required in these sort of communications isn't matched the other way. So in this case, let's say I'm received as rude, but the other person, let's say my manager, who is perceiving me as rude, is not necessarily taking the effort to understand that I don't attach meaning to tone the same way they do. And so we have a disconnect because we're not acknowledging we think differently.
That's really helpful. And I think the takeaway is that making assumptions about people's intention is really difficult when we come from diverse perspectives. I'm going to move us along because we have so many great questions, but I would like to take a few minutes just to understand this final theme, which is, quels sont les défis les plus courants auxquels les personnes autistes sont confrontées au travail? Jean-Julien?
On va essayer de faire ça court. Il y en a quelques-uns qui sont effectivement plus simples. On a parlé des préjugés. Donc, je pense que ce qu'il faut, c'est rester ouvert. Souvent, la flexibilité dont on peut avoir besoin est quelque chose qui est sous-utilisé, sous-exploité, alors que ça devrait être mis de l'avant. Donc, concrètement, moi, j'ai plusieurs de mes collègues qui sont plus efficients l'après-midi et en soirée que tôt le matin. parce qu'on peut avoir des soucis des enjeux de sommeil ou de fatigue. Donc d'avoir de se donner le droit de profiter de cette flexibilité dans une optique d'efficience. Je pense que c'est important souvent de considérer ça. Les obstacles courants peuvent être souvent de vouloir forcer une intégration. Euh, Moi, j'ai plein d'exemples où, tu sais, si j'allais pas à un party de bureau, c'était pas bien vu. Si je participais pas aux activités offertes par l'entreprise, on allait toujours me traiter de weirdo ou de personne qui veut pas s'intégrer. Et en fait, non, c'est juste que moi, ça répond pas nécessairement aux besoins d'intégration que je peux apporter à l'entreprise. Donc, euh, si je peux résumer ça, c'est il y a un cadre. On a tous besoin d'un cadre commun de fonctionnement. Mais je trouve que la beauté de l'humain, c'est aussi d'avoir cette capacité de sortir du cadre et de voir que, en sortant du cadre, le cadre ne disparaît pas et que ça donne des possibilités supplémentaires aux personnes en emploi de contribuer à ce que le cadre s'agrandisse. Et donc, le cadre est toujours là, mais il prend des couleurs supplémentaires, il prend des formes supplémentaires. Donc, les défis, je dirais, c'est surtout de donner ce message-là. C'est, OK, je suis conscient qu'il y a un cadre, mais est-ce que je peux sortir de temps en temps du cadre? Et est-ce que ça va permettre à l'entreprise de pouvoir, elle aussi, agrandir son carré de sable, agrandir son terrain de jeu? Donc, le défi principal, je pense qu'il est là, ouais.
Thank you, Jean-Julien. I'm going to summarize that probably not as eloquently to say people over process, looking at how processes can be expanded to focus on the work itself as opposed to the process itself. Tony, can I turn this question over to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Most common challenge. I think I'm going to take a moment to talk about autistic burnout. I think this might be something, and I think that is sort of maybe the outcome of, or like the culmination potentially of series of challenges that can sometimes go on or can be sort of micro challenges on a day-to-day basis. And so I sort of referred to, previously not knowing I was autistic and sort of compensating and navigating things and masking so much that I was really just depleting my battery, on an ongoing basis. And so by the time the workday would come, I often wouldn't have capacity for much more. And so with that reality, eventually that turns into that has a compounding impact. And while there's a lot of things that can sort of mitigate the reality of autistic burnout, also the reality is that autistic people are still autistic when they're not working, right? So we're still processing, we're still living a full life that, we're also experiencing lots of processing from, lots of, stimulus from, and things like that. And the outcome, if we're not really in a workplace where we have an opportunity to engage in flexible supports or to not mask for a day, or have sort of, a comfortable enough relationship that you can say, to your manager, hey, I'm really burnt out, I need a day. Not being in positions where you're not really able to do that, at the end of the day becomes a retention issue. And becomes like you have an employee that, becomes a retention issue or potentially can become a performance issue, depending on how it's impacting someone. And so, but in the background, you potentially have an autistic person who's completely burnt out from their environment and sort of the ongoing things that they're experiencing. And a really simple example I can give is I did not know, despite working 8 years in an office, that I have a sensitivity to overhead lighting. So almost around 1 p.m. every day, I would get a brutal headache that would often mean that I really struggled to be overly productive in the afternoon. And I really struggled with it. It was something I felt a lot of shame about. I didn't understand why it was so hard for me. And then I started working from home and I got an overhead lamp. that goes right over my computer. And now I no longer have sort of that sensory overwhelm was resulting in burnout, as an example. And so now that I have the flexibility to, one, be at home, but also to understand these sort of options, I'm able to mitigate the potential challenges, and it increases my capacity to deal with other challenges. And so that was a really roundabout sort of way of saying that autistic burnout is a reality for many, many autistic employees. It is not the same as sort of how we regularly talk about burnout. Autistic burnout can come in cycles of, you could be burnt out by noon on a day. You could be burnt out, a couple times a week. The cycles are incredibly different, and sort of acknowledging that and providing flexibility for people to take care of themselves how they need to, while still being able to do their job, is a delicate balance to find, but it's possible.
Thank you. That's really important information that you're sharing, Tony. And I'm going to move us on in a moment, but I wonder if one of you can briefly speak to the idea. People here are hearing, okay, well, you don't know if someone's autistic, and someone might not have told me that they're autistic. So how am I going to meet their needs at work without knowing? I wonder if just briefly one of you can speak to that.
Ask questions. So I think if you assumptions, if there's an opportunity to provide structure, to understand why someone may be experiencing a certain challenge, sort of having a conversation, seeing if there's a different way to approach the project, things like that. You don't need to know that somebody's autistic, but also there's a plethora of other experiences that someone could have that could be presenting as challenges at work, or whatever their reality of their experience is at that time. And so being able to ask questions and understanding that some of the supports that I benefit from and as an autistic person also benefit everyone else. I like to have meeting notes. I like to have an agenda. I like to get my deliverables in writing. I like to have notice before a meeting. I like to have context, not just, my manager, Ali, sending me a Teams invitation the night before saying, hey, important meeting, with no other context, right? Like, I'm not going to sleep that night, which I think most people wouldn't, but that's sort of an example of something that we talk about as being a neuroinclusive practice, and we talk about in this context, but I think all of us certainly benefit from that. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so ways to create a universally accessible workplace, getting to know your employees and understand them irrespective of disclosure is what I'm hearing. Thank you, Tony. This last piece is for our panelists, and the idea is, what do you wish would have been asked? Is there something we haven't talked about that you feel is important to convey? Quelles sont les questions que nous aimerions que tu nous poses, Jean-Julien?
Pour faire écho à la question que tu posais tout à l'heure, c'est vrai que si la personne ne le dit pas, s'il n'y a pas de questions vis-à-vis de son collègue pour le supporter, ça peut être difficile. En fait, ce qu'il faut savoir, c'est que on n'est peut-être pas visible, mais on existe. Que autour de nous, il y a déjà un certain nombre de personnes qui sont neurodivergentes et autistes, et sans qu'on le sache. Fait que ça aussi, c'est des choses importantes à considérer, c'est que t'as pas besoin de le savoir. Et pour faire du millage aussi avec ce que Tony disait, je pense que si on a tous une posture d'être à l'écoute, de trouver des opportunités de mieux fonctionner ensemble, à ce moment-là, on n'est plus dans l'étiquette de l'autisme ou de la neurodivergence, mais on est vraiment dans le être ensemble pour arriver à un objectif qui nous motive les uns les autres. Fait que des fois, c'est juste de se poser les bonnes questions. Comment je peux faire pour l'aider? Comment moi je peux évoluer dans mes biais ou ma façon de penser grâce aux différences que l'autre m'amène. Donc c'est souvent ces questions-là, des fois, qu'on devrait se poser plutôt que de dire ça mange quoi un autiste le matin, de quoi s'est constitué un autiste en journée. Enfin, tu sais, c'est pas des questions qui sont vraiment pertinentes, mais plutôt de dire comment moi je peux profiter de l'occasion qu'on a d'être différents pour avancer ensemble.
Thank you, Jean-Julien. That's really important. The value of diversity of thought and diversity of experience in a group, and how can we embrace that and benefit as a society? Tony, is there anything you wish that we were talking about that we haven't discussed so far?
I think the one thing that comes to mind is that I often hear neurodiversity talked about as if we're only talking about autistic folks or folks with ADHD or folks who are neurodivergent. We're not talking about whereas like we've sort of decided, it seems, that neurodiversity is synonymous with neurodivergent, and that it means the same thing. So often we hear, oh yeah, we gotta increase, we gotta empower or embrace neurodiversity. We're talking about everyone. We're talking about all of our brilliant minds working together and harnessing our strengths and experiences and being able to have an incredibly diverse team that can, do different things and can do novel things. But I think often because we see maybe when we talk about neurodiversity, we only think about sort of the differences from neurotypical or non-neurodivergent sort of let me take that back. We often think about it as neurodivergent experiences, and I think that is why we often don't realize that we have differences and that we are all those that are not autistic or not ADHD or don't have dyslexia or whatever their experience may be. Like, you also communicate in a certain way. You also have a diverse way of communicating and are part of that neurodiversity. And so we have a responsibility to sort of interact with one another with that awareness. And I think once we acknowledge that and really harness it, we can do some pretty great things. But I think, really just knowing that we're all part of that neurodiversity, not just neurodivergent people.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Tony. And thank you to our panelists. La discussion a été très intéressante et j'aimerais vraiment remercier les membres du panel pour avoir partagé avec nous leurs connaissances, leur point de vue, leur expérience. I've learned a lot today. I hope for those of you participating that we've answered your questions and that you've learned something too that you can take with you into your day, into your week, into your life, and feel more confident and comfortable getting conversations started around neurodiversity.